can. A very important file, point 22, the control of the acquisition and possession of weapons. Our rapporteur, of course, is Bodil Valero. I can see our shadows are present here, most of them. So we have the consideration of the draft opinion now and the decision on deadline for tabling amendments. Just as a quick introduction, the LIBE committee is associated under Rule 54 with the IMCO committee. LIBE will have exclusive competence for crime definitions, fundamental rights and data protection issues, including aspects relevant to the data filing systems and exchange of personal data, as well as penalties. I'll leave the rest to Ms. Valero to explain. Now, as LIBE has got joint competence for security-related issues, we can also propose more suitable amendments on other articles, as we already did in 2008, as the rapporteur under Rule 54 knows. So I'm now going to ask our LIBE rapporteur, Ms. Bodil Valero, to take the floor and present her draft opinion, after which I'll ask the shadows to make a response. Bodil, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start by thanking all of those who've helped me with their points of view. My staff and I have had our mailboxes very full, and we've tried to answer them and deal with them as best we could. I'd also like to thank the shadow rapporteurs who've made some very helpful inputs in the preparatory meeting we had ahead of my opinion. It is a difficult question, and there are many sensitive feelings here. I think that the change to the directive is presented as part of the fight against terrorism after the attacks in Paris, rather than as a proposal to try and plug a gap in existing legislation. And hunters feel that they're paying a very high price for this and may not have the possibility to continue to exercise their sport and hobbies. And I understand their frustrations. But as the rapporteur of the opinion for this committee, I think there's a lot in the Commission's proposal which is good and not at all controversial. There is a need for a directive to get a better level of security and safety throughout the EU. The provision of licenses for getting a weapon is different from country to country. And sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's permanent licenses. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's more difficult. There's a report by the Flemish Institute that 6,200 people acquire weapons every year in the EU, and often suicides committed with illegal weapons. People are often shot by illegal weapons. This is men that are shot by illegal weapons on the street, but women tend to be shot by illegal weapons at home. So all of this needs to be dealt with, and we also need to prevent illegal weapons ending up in the wrong hands. Now, we had representatives from Europol here the other week saying that all weapons in circulation were once legal weapons, and it is important that we don't get that move from legal to illegal. And with that, I'll actually now look at my opinion and concentrate on just one or two more controversial parts of the opinion. The Commission has proposed that weapons that look like automatic weapons should be banned, and the Commission also said to the committee that they shouldn't make life more difficult for hunters and shooters. And having looked into that, I cannot see there being any other way than dealing with very large quantities of weapons, and hunters and shooters are likely to be hit very hard by this. And we know that IMCO is working on this, but I would ask the Commission to review its proposal, and I think either you could withdraw parts of the proposal that deal with weapons that are similar to or look like automatic weapons, or the Commission, if they decide to stick with their proposal, should base it on technical criteria instead of the appearance of the weapon. There are a number of possible criteria, and the police have brought these possibilities to my attention. The police have referred to the big problem, and that is these large magazines. A Swedish report back in 2014 proposed a regulation, but this didn't actually end up as a bill before the Parliament. But I would nevertheless like to come back to the issue, because an alternative to a total ban might be that there might be a regulation on magazines. I know that it's rather controversial amongst shooters, but I think it is worth taking up the discussion with the other shadow rapporteurs. I think marking and weapons licenses may be required to purchase magazines for certain weapons and also particularly for larger magazines. I don't think the proposal is very clear on this, but I'm sure that if we join together and we look at our amendments, we may get the possibility to get this discussed amongst the shadow rapporteurs and come up with something. The Commission is proposing a compulsory medical test, and I'm suggesting that you could replace that with a suitability test that could be carried out by different actors depending on how the system looks in different countries. Every country would decide for themselves how the test would be carried out and which authority would do it. The system for authorization of licenses is varied from country to country at the moment, and I do think that one model is better than a multiplicity. Now, in Sweden, you don't have to have a medical test, but it doesn't mean that somebody's suitability isn't investigated. When hunters and shooters are trained at the same time, there is a form of social control because a person's extreme views might be discovered. And that, I think, is actually easier than doing it via a medical test. I would suggest that physical and psychological capacity should be part of it, but not an intelligence test, as some people are interpreting that as being. I think maybe a vision test should be compulsory, and anybody with dementia should not be allowed to have a weapon. A berry picker was shot by a hunter recently who thought that it was an elk. Now, I don't know whether it was their vision that was at fault or something else, but there have been gaps in the provision, so this needs to be plugged. There need to be continued exemptions, but we mustn't call the safety into question. There are paragraphs that the Commission has taken out of the original directive. Some countries have built their responses on the basis of their civil defence approach, and Swedish defence would be hard hit, amongst others, which can't be the purpose of the Commission's proposal. I think we are likely to have many discussions about this. I think there are some highly controversial elements. I'd like to thank everybody, including the shadows, for their points of view expressed so far, and I very much look forward to good and constructive cooperation on this opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some very constructive points there. I'm going to go to the shadows. We have some shadows present. If they'd like to speak on this, Mr. Mello, do you want to take the floor?
Thank you, Chairman. Now, look, the rapporteur has just told us that it's crucial for all arms to be legal. I agree. Perhaps we should be focusing on illegal arms rather than legal firearms here. Now, if you want to tackle illegal arms in a directive on legal firearms, that doesn't seem to make much sense. It's a bit of a contradiction. Now, the rapporteur quite rightly stresses that although the purpose of the directive is to improve citizen safety, it doesn't tackle illegal arms and criminal and terrorist actions. Now, it was the terrorist attacks in Paris in particular that provide the impetus for this directive. This is a Commission initiative. Now, may I remind you that when Mr. Juncker came forward with his initiative in the plenary in Strasbourg, what he said, I quote, Chairman, was
on Europe's people and values were coordinated across borders, showing that we must work together to resist these threats. Today's proposal, prepared jointly by Commissioners Izvieta Bielowska and Dimitris Avramopoulos, will help us tackle the threat of weapons falling into the hands of terrorists. Ou seja,
in other words, right from the presentation of his initiative in the plenary, the President of the Commission made it clear that the motivation was the terrorist attacks. It wasn't a revision of the directive with hunters in mind. I believe there's a tragic mistake here that Parliament needs to flag up. Terrorism and other activities linked to firearms should not be confused. Associating legal possession of arms and ammunition with terrorism will not only not solve the problem of terrorism, it will punish people who, in a legal way, paying their taxes and obeying the rules, hold firearms. That's to say, hunters, athletes, antiques collectors, sports people. People may collect arms, they may hunt with them, and they may be used in various sporting events. That's been the case for centuries now. It's nothing new. No, of course, they could be used to commit crimes, but terrorists, it so happens, don't actually use legal arms. If you're going to commit a crime, you don't want to be detected, do you? So it seems something strange to suggest that someone who doesn't want to be detected is going to buy an arm legally and have the name on a register if it's going to use that arm to commit a crime. This isn't a logical way of fighting terrorism. So the criminals are still going to be there, and this will solve nothing. On the rapporteur's position, may I say there are some points I beg to differ on. For example, which is about a 5-year assessment of licences. The Commission is saying it will be compulsory to renew your licence every 5 years. The rapporteur wants to simplify that. May I just remind you, in the instance of hunting, there are a variety of licences which coexist. You need a licence to be a hunter and a licence to hunt in a particular area as well as a gun licence. If a country grants a citizen a licence, he would be entitled to hunt until the age of 60, but having paid the taxes, having studied, you're going to say that the person's got to have a medical and have an exam every 5 years? What does the government do with the hunting licence? You can say, all right, you can hunt till you're 60, and then what? Use a stick or something? It doesn't make much sense. The legislative process has to be sensible. If a citizen passes a test, well, you could use a car as a weapon, couldn't you? Terrorists have done that, to cram the explosives in there and blow up the car. Are we going to force people to have driving tests every 5 years? I mean, what makes this so absurd is the way we're confusing terrorism and ordinary legal uses of firearms. Let me remind you that in Europe there are many countries where we manufacture arms and ammunition for legal purposes. Has anyone carried out an impact study of the problems with jobs and growth that would follow in the economy of our countries without that? I'll leave it there, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The S&D shadow is Sylvie Yvonne Kaufmann, please.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender, und auch recht.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our rapporteur, who's made an awful lot of effort to try and come up with constructive proposals for dealing with this directive. Let me say first of all that I've had various talks, but we also had the hearing here in IMCO, where the making of a link between terrorism and organised crime is, thinking about Paris, one that doesn't really pertain when it comes to this directive. I think we need to be clear that it's a question of raising general safety rather than a question of trying to fight terrorism. The rapporteur has made a number of proposals which I would endorse. For example, this proposal that there should be rules for safe storage of arms and ammunition. Also, the marking of all the essential components of a weapon is another important proposal, and the electronic exchange of information on authorizations or rejected authorizations between member states. We've got a problem with the so-called B7 weapons, which look like automatic weapons of war, and the expert that attended the hearing said that the external appearance should not be used as a criterion, and we do need, I think, to think about whether there might be technical criteria that would provide this degree of legal certainty and help define what would belong in category A, the prohibited firearms category, and I think that this then ought to be usable in practice. When it comes to medical tests, there are amendments 12 and 13 on that by the rapporteur. It is clear that the personal situation and medical state of the person can change rapidly and considerably, and if you acquire and hold arms, that may make sense. But we do need a high level of standardization at the same time, and we'd have to be quite sure that at the end of such an examination we would be able to determine whether somebody was suitable or not suitable because of their physical, mental or psychological state to possess a weapon. And the doctor that would carry out an investigation should not have to be made liable if they exercised the requirements of the law. I think the rapporteur has talked about that, but it shouldn't just be reduced to the deciding authority, but the doctor should also be included in that. Follow-up investigations, examinations have been referred to. Maybe that they should be slightly less stringent examinations, but I think that's not very clearly formulated, and the criteria that have been suggested for the first examination should perhaps also apply when it comes to a renewal of the license. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I've got 3 specific questions I'd like to address to the rapporteur, because I'm not entirely sure whether I have correctly understood her amendments. The first is Amendment 11. It's about this liability insurance. In the justification, the rapporteur says that the liability insurance applies to the arm and not just the owner, but in the actual amendment that isn't entirely clear, and I'm not entirely sure what the justification for additional liability insurance for an arm would be, because it seems to me that the intended protection of the victim is one where the actual owner should have this liability insurance. Then in Amendment 20, we're talking about a change of the categories of weapons. We've got the salute acoustic and other weapons, and there's a suggestion about, so this is Amendment 24 being put into different categories. And then Amendment 25, these are transitional provisions proposed by the rapporteur, but is suggesting that these transitional arrangements should only apply to magazines and essential components of a weapon, but not for legally acquired weapons. And I'm rather surprised at that latter point, why it's being reduced to essential components and magazines of a weapon. Thank you.
So we have on now for the ECR shadow, it's Mr. Halla-aho, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank also Mrs. Valero for the draft opinion. Since time is a limited resource, I will only focus on points that I disagree with. Firstly, the Commission proposal to ban B7 firearms, that is, semi-automatic rifles that resemble automatic rifles. As Mrs. Valero points out correctly, and as many experts have explained to us, the resemblance criteria should be abandoned. It is subjective, impossible to implement, and irrelevant. Mrs. Valero suggests that we should instead consider banning or restricting certain external features, such as pistol grips, collapsible stocks, and cooling systems, by which I believe she refers to so-called barrel shrouds or ventilated handguards. While these features are more objective and easily defined than resemblance, they are not relevant for the aims of the directive. A pistol grip, a collapsible stock, or a barrel shroud are not military features, as many people mistakenly believe. They do not increase the dangerousness of a firearm in the hands of a criminal. Their purpose is to improve the ergonomics, the accuracy, and the durability of a firearm. These are very important for a sport shooter because sport shooting is about shooting accurately for extended periods of time. Ergonomics and accuracy are much less relevant for criminals and terrorists. For example, the rifle Mr. Breivik used in Norway in 2011 had no pistol grip, no collapsible stock, and no barrel shroud. That didn't help his victims very much, did it? It should also be understood that most modern weapons have a modular structure. This means that external non-essential components, such as pistol grips, are not fixed features of a firearm. They are rather something that can be removed and replaced easily. If we ban, for example, pistol grips, the gun owners will buy a new stock without a pistol grip. In the end, they will still have exactly the same weapon, and we will have a lot of angry European citizens who think we are idiots. Mrs. Valero also suggests that we could restrict the availability of high-capacity magazines. This is very problematic for a number of reasons. To begin with, there is an endless number of high-capacity magazines already in private hands. They are all unregistered and therefore untraceable. If we send a signal that they are about to be banned or restricted, people will go to a gun store and buy more of them. Retroactive restrictions simply do not work. Regulating magazines would also be pointless because criminals and terrorists do not use legal weapons anyway. Their illegal weapons come from former Yugoslavia or are assembled from improperly deactivated ex-firearms. There are lots of small companies, often one- or two-person enterprises, that manufacture or sell unregulated firearm accessories, such as stocks or magazines. If magazines required authorization, the dealers and manufacturers would become subject to much more stringent regulations and controls. Many of them could not afford this and would have to quit their business. We would do a lot of damage and achieve nothing. Mr. Chair, we may have different opinions about firearms, but I hope we can all agree on the principle that any restrictive legislation should be fair, proportionate, and based on facts, not on ignorance, prejudice, and scaremongering. Some of us may feel that we must react somehow to security threats, and that doing anything is better than doing nothing. This is not true. Even doing nothing is better than doing the wrong things. Fortunately, there are many useful things that we can do, and many of those are included in the Commission proposal. But there are also many things in the proposal that must be changed. We should delete the proposed categories A6 and A7, that is, civilian semi-automatic rifles, and also the proposed total ban on Category A firearms. These weapons are already strictly controlled, and their role in gun crime is negligible, despite the repeated false statements by the Commission representatives. We should not approve the time-limited gun permits or mandatory medical checks, as they only increase uncertainty and bureaucracy, not security. We should not include sound moderators or magazines in essential components because they are not essential components. I will table a number of amendments to this effect, and I hope our colleagues could consider supporting them. Mr. Chair, there is a growing dissatisfaction among the population with the inability of the European Union to deal with the financial crisis, the immigration crisis, and the terrorist threat. I think it is very unwise, on top of that, to attack our law-abiding, tax-paying citizens and stigmatize them as a security problem, which they are not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now for the ALDE shadow is Cecilia Wickstrom, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And first of all, thanks to you, Bodil, for your work. And there is a lot of good elements in the opinion that are good. But in my view, it does not go far enough in order to strike an appropriate balance between security on the one hand and protection of the legitimate interests of legal gun owners on the other hand. Let me tell you that I grew up in Sweden. My father was a great hunter and a policeman. Many of the people I grew up around owned legal guns, and this was considered absolutely normal. What we need to be able to do now is to find a treatment where legal and law-abiding gun owners, to treat them with respect, whilst at the same time pursuing a sensible approach on gun control legislation. This needs to be done. Europe has already a strong and strict regulation on firearms, which is good. We do not want an American situation where anyone can walk into a gun show and almost buy a machine gun without any restrictions. But since we already have very strict regulations on gun ownership in Europe, we should be careful not to propose new and stricter rules unless they can be clearly motivated from, example, a security standpoint. I think that the Commission frankly did a very bad job at striking this balance, and many of the proposals are not acceptable. Although I like some of the proposals from the rapporteur, several of them would actually go even further than the Commission proposal. This is frankly not acceptable. Also, many necessary amendments are, in my view, missing. Some key points that I would like to share with you. I will propose to delete completely the ban of certain semi-automatic firearms because there are simply no arguments being put forward convincing enough to explain why these weapons are so dangerous. Actually, the Commission has even admitted that the definition is so badly written that they don't even know which firearms that they potentially will be covered by this ban. I would argue that if you don't even know what you want to ban, then it subsequently is a bit hard to explain to citizens why you want to ban it. I will propose the complete deletion of the mandatory 5-year limit to licenses and also the suggestion for medical checks. Why? Because renewing all firearms license every 5 years would take enormous amounts of resources from the authorities for very little or maybe even no added value. It would obviously also inconvenience law-abiding gun owners for no good reason at all. And the mandatory medical checks seem quite pointless. The medical expert that was here last time was very clear about this. There is no doctor on this planet that can be able to determine whether someone is not suitable to own a gun after a brief meeting of a few minutes. Further on, collectors and museums should obviously stay excluded from the scope of the directive, as is the case today. I doubt that we have a big problem with organized crime or terrorists raiding museums for Napoleonic-era muskets, and still the Commission would have us permanently destroy all military firearms in collections all around museums in European member states. Is this normal? On the online sales, I think that the rapporteur is on a good path, even though I think that we still need to tweak the language a bit to ensure that member states can opt for various different ways to allow online sales, but with some additional controls. I could continue a bit, but I will not, since I guess we will have some more time to debate this also once all the amendments are in. But thank you for now, and let's try to be proportionate and balanced.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Next is Mr. Albiol, please. Sorry, yes, it's the GUI shadow.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Around 6,000 people die every year because of firearms in the EU, and there are lots of studies that show that easier access to firearms leads to higher rates of death due to weapons. So I think this directive is very important on weapons. What we want to see is complete traceability of weapons and ammunition, so you can see exactly who has been involved with these weapons, and that can only be done through very strict controls and penalties for those who do not comply. There are a number of reforms proposed. We think the most important are to do with improved traceability, as I've already mentioned, standards for online acquisition of weapons, and the prohibition of certain semi-automatic weapons. We think that the proposal is insufficient. We need to go a lot further. We want to see a ban on online sales, also for alarm weapons that could have dual use functions. We think Mrs. Valero's report is going in the right direction, and we share a number of points, but we do need to go further, and we will do our work by tabling amendments. We think widening the scope of the directive is positive, not just for weapons, but also to its essential components and ammunition. We think it's important to improve safety. We share, as I said, a number of views with the rapporteur, but we will add some points because we really do need to go further in this area. Thank you.
I think the other shadows are not present here for the time being, so if I could ask Ms. Valero to respond, but we have two members who want to take the floor. I've been told very strictly that we are massively, and people are, for the next item, are just going to leave. And I mean, I think it's the worst timing I've reached since I've become chair, which is good. I mean, it shows you that I'm sticking to time mostly, but if colleagues could just please, if we could just go back to the rapporteur now, please, because it's just going to be impossible. Colleagues will leave and we won't be able to do the next item. I mean, the shadows have given really high quality presentations, so I mean, this is going to come back very quickly, and I promise I'm going to take Ms. Chinichi and Mr. Lopez Aguilar for the next time, but we just can't because I'll lose all the members for the next item. We're about 40 minutes adrift. Ms. Valero, can you do a very quick sum up, and then obviously you're going to have shadows meetings, but just very quickly on the key points of disagreement.
Tack, herr ordförande.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, quite a lot of questions there, but we will be having a very good debate about this. Just quickly on the medical tests. There's a great divergence of views on this from country to country. In some countries, it goes without saying that you should have a doctor's test, and in Sweden, you don't. There are some countries with a one-year license. Now the Commission is proposing a 5-year limit to licenses. And once again, as with the medical test or the suitability test that I'm proposing instead of the medical test, you've got this new investigation not having to be quite as extensive and therefore not bringing about quite so much bureaucracy. You've got transitional rules on magazines, and really it comes down to whether magazines are essential components. Well, you've got a lot of magazines in circulation that people have bought legally and would become illegal, and so there must be a transitional period. You have to have a simple way in which the authorities could be notified that you've got X number of magazines of that kind. Now, I'm very open to all of your proposals. I'm quite sure we'll be able to talk our way to the right solution that we can all then support. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being brief. I want to apologise to the three members who wanted to take the floor. I promise I will take them first in the next debate on this. I just think Mr Lopez Aguilar explained already that members for the next item and the item after that are going to leave, and it's just unfair because we're now 30 or 40 minutes too late, so I just have to move